Hi, I'm Scott from Bago Games, and today I am here with
Aaron.
Nick.
and we're going to be talking about their new game, MetaMorph. So, firstly, could you tell us a little bit about the game?
So MetaMorph is a arcade tactical dungeon crawler, similar to the likes of Gauntlet and sort of Diablo, but the special thing about MetaMorph is that you switch between heroes on the fly. So when you go into a certain dungeon or a level we've constructed for you, you can take up to 3 heroes in there, and it's all about sort of switching between them, using their different powers and their different like elemental types to combat sort of different enemies, different traps, and different sort of boss types, and all that sort of jazz. So, yeah.
And it's about crushing enemies with massive Indiana Jones style boulders and buzzsaws and other traps in the dungeon.
So, quite a big part of this game, from what I've seen of the gameplay so far, is there are a lot of traps, and people are dying a lot. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So we've currently got, I think, like 5 or 6 traps in the game. We have flamethrowers that can melt ice elemental enemies very quickly, boulders, which you can actually trigger yourselves, I believe, in some levels to crush like a whole bunch of guys. There's buzzsaws, which actually appear in quite a few levels, and initially we actually had it so that the traps couldn't hurt enemies, they could only hurt you, which both felt unfair and wasn't very fun, so we changed it so they can just like saw through like a whole bunch of skeletons or whatever, which feels great. And basically every single time we do an update, we add, along with like maybe a character or a boss, we add traps, just because kind of taking the game to shows, that's kind of what we've seen people enjoying the most, like not even attacking, just like leading a bunch of unsuspecting poor like skeletons into this path, this thing which just like melts just through them, and it kind of sets it apart from other dungeon crawlers as well, and there are so many good ones out there. So
And it adds to sort of the action and the tactical strategy. So it's about using sort of the levels, and as Nick said, we have loads of different traps and like elemental traps in there, and it's all about using your particular elemental type to use that elemental trap to your advantage, because there'll be different types of enemies, like ice enemies, and then we have fire traps. So using the, like for example, the fire nymph up there, so the fire nymph's immune to fire, but obviously the ice enemies won't be, take more damage from them, so use her, lure them into like flamethrowers and stuff, and it's all about sort of adding to like the strategy and the tactical, which is very much in our DNA as a studio.
So you've touched on the characters a bit there. They're quite different. What are the characters like? Who are the characters?
So the characters are all based upon sort of, we tried to do sort of a rock paper scissors, sort of like Pokemon type of elemental system. So giving them the whole sort of unique play styles and all their different abilities, and as I said again, elemental types, and sort of basing them all like in sort of like fire and ice, and sort of we have neutral, which is the rabbit, and then we have our recent hero, the rat man, who's a poison elemental. So basing them in these different elemental types. So again, when you take them into dungeons, it's sort of like you have to think about what type of different elemental types will be best for that dungeon, because every single dungeon will be distinctly different. We'll have like time dungeons, we'll have dungeons where we just throw a crap ton of enemies at you, again with the different traps. So it's all about sort of basing the characters within set of elemental categories, so that you have to think about which elemental category is best for that certain dungeon.
And they also have their own sort of archetypes as well. So the rogue, the rabbit is kind of like your rogue DPS character, like all-rounder. The ogre is kind of your tank for the group. The nymph is kind of a mix between an archer and a mage, so you're kind of ranged, fighter. And then the rat's our first addition to the team, and he's sort of your assassin-style character. He can cloak, he can trap enemies, and it's all part of the gameplay. So we kind of encourage you to swap between them, obviously, during each game. You can pick 3 heroes per dungeon. So before going into a dungeon, like Aaron was saying, you need to look into what type of elements can you expect in that dungeon, how can you best counter them, but also what kind of creatures do you need? Are you going to be fighting a bunch of brutes, in which case you need the ogre? But do those brutes have a specific elemental type? Are they fire? They're just going to melt the ogre straight away. So you kind of have to think about what sort of like your team comp, just like an Overwatch or a game like that, but in terms of what types the characters are and what their elements are, and that's kind of like a 2-layer strategy that you have even before you go into the level. And it might mean coming back out and changing your team and going back in and just getting wrecked, but that's all part of the fun.
But then again, we design all the dungeons to be very like short session times. Yeah. So if you do jump into a dungeon and you find it's too hard, or you've got the wrong loadout, or even if you've got the right heroes but you haven't got the right abilities within those heroes, you can just jump out, switch around, and tactically think about which heroes and which abilities are best to use within that dungeon.
So there's a lot of changing with you have a lot of versatility with the different characters and the different abilities. So how many characters have you got planned? Have you got any more planned other than the 4 that you've got already?
So we've got 4 at the moment, but we're hoping to add within the early access period at least 2 more. And also, in addition to that, some Lords of Death, which are our bosses, to sort of combat those particular heroes.
Yeah, we definitely feel like 5 or 6 heroes. We're definitely going to add 1, maybe 2, hopefully 2. But 5 or 6 heroes feels like the right kind of number for like the full game. If you have to choose a team of 3 to come into each dungeon, that gives you a layer of sort of like a nice layer of strategy. At the moment, we've only got 4, so it's kind of like you're kind of just swapping one out. But yeah, 5 or 6, and then potentially if the game does really well, then we could add some post-launch. But that's all down to how players kind of receive it.
So you just mentioned then you're currently in early access. So when can we expect a full title launch?
Full title launch is planned for autumn 2018.
And what's going to be added leading up to? You've mentioned hopefully 2 characters. Is there anything else you're planning on adding during the early access period before launch?
Yeah, so with big updates with where we add characters, we hopefully add more traps, more elemental types, new enemies, and we're also adding, as I said, Lords of Death, which are sort of our bosses. So in this demo we've got the Butcher, but we recently added the Diva, and each one of them will have sort of, just like our heroes, have different play styles, different cycles of attacks, which particular heroes will be good against, particular heroes will be bad against, and it's all about sort of like, with each update, throwing a whole new bunch of things that the player and new sort of enemies and traps sort of add to your toolkit to tactically sort of dispatch foes in ways you haven't done before in previous updates.
And the dungeon will continue to expand, obviously, with levels as you go deeper and deeper and deeper. So we've got about 75 at the moment, and then at launch we're hoping to have over 100.
So roughly, how long do you think playtime from start to finish this game would take for a player?
My maths is terrible for someone who's a marketing person who's supposed to be a science, but each level is between like 5 and 15 minutes, depending on how easy it is, how good your team is, whether the level has a mini boss or a full boss. But I'd say for 75 levels, that kind of length per level, we're looking at like maybe 12 hours at the moment, sort of for the game, I think. That's what we've been seeing.
And obviously the art style has been quite, you've got quite a lot of compliments so far about the art style. Very kind of reminiscent of games like Torchlight and stuff like that, like similar dungeon crawler kind of thing. Do you want to have a talk about the style and the graphics of the game?
So I guess like in terms of the gameplay, the closest sort of touch point would be Gauntlet, but you play as all the characters at once. That's kind of our sort of like elevator pitch. But yeah, so the art style is kind of Torchlight's the easiest touch point, just because it's got like an overall dark fantasy feel to it, but you've still got those kind of punchy colours. And that's one thing we really liked about Torchlight. And we thought, if we're going to do this elemental system in the game, why not kind of make even more of that? So yeah, that's kind of our biggest influence visually. I wish we had the artists here; they could answer this question far better than I could. But yeah, Torchlight is our sort of like main influence, and obviously Gauntlet as well in terms of art style, just in terms of like the whole game being set underground. Lots of people ask us whether there's an overworld, and it was a very sort of deliberate choice to make it all dungeons, all below ground, all kind of in having that style, just because if you have that overall sort of slightly darker feel to it, you can punch out with the characters themselves, the really sort of like powerful reds on the bosses, the elements that we were talking about before, and just loads and loads of particle effects, and everyone loves particle effects, so yeah.
So obviously the game is doing quite well currently. It's been quite popular here. So what are you kind of like estimating for how well it's going to do once it launches?
Not sure really. I mean, we'd be happy with tens of thousands of sales. I mean, obviously we're not a tiny company. We can't really call ourselves an indie. We're about 10 people in London, 5 people in the US, and then 5 up in Scotland. So yeah, I think I'd be happy with that. The game's been doing quite well in early access, sort of aligned with most of our expectations, and we've got like 5,000 wish lists, I think, at the moment, which is really, really nice. So I'm keen to see sort of when we actually launch, whether those people who like for me as well, like if I saw a game in early access, I really just want to wishlist it. So I can totally understand that point of view. So I'm really interested to see how it does at launch, because that will kind of give us an indication of like where we can expect the game to go sort of from there.
So you mentioned Gauntlet and like obviously Torchlight for like some of the art styles and stuff. What was the kind of inspiration for this game, like going forward? Why did you make a dungeon crawler?
I can see your mouth
opening up. I think there's a. So basically, usually Firefly Studios does the Stronghold series, which are like a bunch of castle simulation games, sort of building economies and that sort of thing. So I think MetaMorph, again, I'm just the marketing department, so this was from the higher ups. But I think we just got a little bit bored with sort of making RTS games and strategy games, and just wanted a break from that. Even if it was just for a year and a half, I believe.
Yeah, and it'll result in better games in the long term, because sometimes if you just do a sequel after sequel after sequel after sequel, you just lose, there's burnout, but you also just lose perspective on it.
Yeah.
And if you have a year or two to kind of step away from it, you can come back and go, okay, now that our heads aren't sort of stuck in the middle of that anymore, like, what did we do wrong? What do people want from us for the next game? And it's just going to result in a better sequel, I think, going forward.
So obviously you mentioned Stronghold, and now you've stepped away for a couple of years. Is there anything about Stronghold that's coming up after MetaMorph launches?
We are hoping to reveal our new Stronghold at the end of this year. So yes, so we are working on a new Stronghold.
So that's a good little tidbit. We'll definitely have to come back to you when that launches. But yeah, so basically, if you wanted someone to buy the game, how would you sell it? How do you sell the game to someone?
It is Diablo, but you play as all the characters at the same time. So if you're playing Diablo, you get like 5 hours in, you think, the Barbarian's kind of fun, but I've seen this stream of someone playing as the Wizard. I really wish I could change over to that. With this game, it's just one button, switch to the Wizard. Then you see another YouTube video of the Necromancer, you think, the guy looks really cool. This one, you just hit a button, you change that person, and the only way to beat our game is to morph constantly and to do that. And it's kind of like, I would call it tactical dungeon crawling. Or action strategy, as you said earlier.
Yeah, so building on our sort of DNA as a strategy-centric studio, we didn't want to go in and just make like a basic hack and slash where you just like have loads of abilities which do a lot of damage. We wanted to combine sort of our DNA within strategy games and use that to make the players sort of think about their loadout and what sort of abilities do which things and combining them. And again, making it like, I don't think we touched on this, but making the game actually quite difficult. So if you don't use tactics, if you aren't sort of thinking about the level strategically, then you're not going to proceed or you're not going to win.
Yeah.
So
there are so many games out there that are just doing the whole loot hack and slash system so well. Like not even just Diablo, like even outside of Diablo in the indie space, there are so many great hack and slash games. And so we had to do something different. Otherwise, it would just be kind of the same kind of thing. And we just didn't want to kind of compete with people that are already doing something so well.
So obviously you've got the kind of strategy element added into the game with the tactical thing. So how, obviously strategy is a very important part of it. How in depth is the strategy element?
So again, we do ramp up the difficulty within MetaMorph to force the player to think about that strategically, and we balance and design all the abilities so that none of them are sort of overpowered or underpowered, and they're all designed to be used within certain dungeon types and with certain enemy traps and against certain enemy types. So it's all about sort of making sort of abilities and elemental heroes really fun, but also making them sort of have different play styles and strategic sort of pros and cons. Yeah. So again, going to this sort of rock, paper, scissors system of, this certain hero and this certain ability is really good versus this certain enemy type, but you can only sort of take a select amount of those heroes or those abilities, with that hero into the dungeon. So yeah, it's all about making sort of sure that you're strategically thinking about the specific abilities you're taking with the specific hero into the dungeon.
Yeah, like you're saying, it's literally like before you even get into the dungeon, you're thinking about the strategy side of things, because you're thinking about your team comp. You're like, who do I take out of currently 4, but 5 or maybe even 6 characters? Who do I take into the dungeon? What have the previous dungeons leading up to this been like? Does that give me an indication of what this dungeon is going to be like in terms of elementals, in terms of traps, in terms of enemies? So you're thinking about the team comp, and then you look at your characters and go, cool, so I've got 2 skill slots per character out of like 6 in total, let's say. Which skills do I use? Because those are essentially like your mini builds for each character. Like the rabbit with like 2 skills versus another 2 skills is going to be a very different character aside from their basic attack. So you have like team comp builds, then you actually go into the dungeon, and then into the dungeon there is the switching characters gameplay, there's the countering elements gameplay, there's the action sort of like combat itself. So there are like 2 distinct layers of strategy before you get into the dungeon, and then once you're in the dungeon, it's strategic gameplay. So yeah, I would say like the sort of RPG-ness is quite light. Like you level up your characters and you level up the skills. There's no loot system. There's no there's loot in the sense that you have upgrades for your characters and skills that drop. But there's no like weapons and armor. So that stuff's quite light. But the strategy, I would say, is quite sort of meaty, and it's there if you really want to get into it.
So we've talked a lot about like the characters and the gameplay itself, but tell me a bit about the enemies. What are they like in the game?
So all the enemies, again, most of them we give elemental types. Some will be completely neutral, and we design them to sort of have loads of different attributes within dungeons. So there'll be some like hulking big dudes who, again, Nick's touched upon. You can then use the ice ogre to kill.
Hulking big dudes.
Yeah, hulking.
Nice.
I don't think that's what they're technically
The name
called.
should play above their character.
Yeah, exactly. We've got other sort of enemy types who can sort of float among sort of passages where there are no sort of there's no groundwork, I suppose, within the dungeon,
Yeah,
so they
the
can
wraiths, yeah.
the wraiths, so they can float above sort of the dead space
So
in
you
the
might
air.
knock a bunch of enemies off the cliff, and then others just kind of come back, and you're like, oh god.
Yeah, exactly. And then some will have some enemy types who will sort of charge at you like maliciously and just like Hulk out. Other enemy types who will back off, so you'll like be forced again to sort of tactically think about sort of how am I going to kill these dudes basically, and sort of some like enemy types will only be killable by certain heroes.
Yeah.
So if you go into a dungeon and you haven't got the right sort of hero loadout with the right abilities, like you can't progress. But again, making the dungeons sort of like short session times, you can then jump back out, load up the correct hero types with the correct abilities, jump back in, and hopefully proceed.
Yeah, it's all designed to just make you swap heroes essentially and make you morph. Because you might go into a sort of a comp of enemies that, like I was saying before, like has, you know, some might be floating so they can't be knocked off an edge, or there might be like a sort of pulsating sort of bloater style character in the middle who you need to be wary of, otherwise they're going to explode and, you know, poison you, especially if you're weak to poison that particular character. Or like there might just be a brute in the middle of a squad of enemies who, you know, you might be able to take the other guys out really quickly, but unless you go in there with your tank, you're not going to be able to take that guy out. So it's about sort of like constantly morphing to sort of deal with different hordes of enemies, and in the same way that you might go into a dungeon that has different elemental types or different traps, there's also dungeons that just have different groups of enemies, and those present sort of different challenges. So you might go into a dungeon thinking, oh, this is really straightforward, and then you just says, you died across the screen, and you're like,
So the game is obviously available now in early access. How much can someone expect to pay for the game at the moment?
So it's £7 at the moment, and it's currently got 4 characters, 75 levels, 2 main bosses, several mini bosses, like 5-6 traps. So it's already got about sort of 20-25% more content than it had at launch. And then once we launch, we've already talked about our plans. We will probably up the price, but obviously anyone that's already owns the game on Steam would get all that stuff, you know, because that's how it works.
Yeah.
So if we want to follow the game and we want to see how the development's going, where can we find you guys?
Firefly Worlds on Twitter, that's what I would say, and then he's going to say
Firefly Worlds on YouTube.
There you go.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's been Firefly Studios talking about their new game MetaMorph. If you want to see more from Rezzed, be sure to subscribe to the Bego Games YouTube channel and check us out on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook.